There's been a video circulating around the past few weeks of a family of porcupines in South Africa. It's been on some news outlets. It's been on social media. It's a family of 4 porcupines. So 2 adult porcupines and 2 baby porcupines, and they're walking down the road in South Africa. This is not a joke, by the way. And they're walking along, and it seems normal, and then a leopard jumps out. Now, it seems really bad for the porcupines in this moment, because all that leopard needs to do is snag one of those babies, and it's good to go. And there's a challenge for the porcupines, right? Because porcupines are kind of built to defend themselves, right? They've got all these quills, but they've got the soft underbelly. So normally what they would do is they would just curl up. But of course, if the parents do that, they lose the babies. Now, it seems that the outcome of this is foregone. The porcupines are going to lose one of those babies. Except no one told the porcupines that. The porcupines just stand there and they defend their babies. And if you've seen the video, it's actually quite incredible. That the babies kind of do what they need to do, which is that they continually run underneath their parents back and forth, so the leopard is always on the other side of a parent. And the parents just keep their backs turned to the leopard the whole time. And after a bunch of times trying and a few quills in his paws, the leopard decides that maybe this dinner isn't worth it. And it's quite amazing because basically the leopard pulls the quills out of his paws, walks away, and the porcupines just carry on like, oh yeah, it's Tuesday. These things happen. And what really stood out to me was that the odds were incredibly against those porcupines. In fact, the way nature often works in a situation like that is the parents would have known that one of the children was the weaker one, and they would have defended only one of them, the strong one. But they didn't do that. They decided that even though everyone watching assumed that this was going to be bad for the porcupines, they weren't going to give in to that. They used what they had. They recognized the reality of their situation, and they fought as hard as they had to using what God had gave them, which were their quills, which are primarily just individual defensive things. But because they stuck together, because they worked together, because they refused to give up, they prevailed against all the odds. The odds were abundantly against them, but they didn't give in. So I want to start a new series today that's around that concept. That although life is hard for porcupines, life's hard for you too. Right? We all have difficult times in our lives. And we all have situations where success seems impossible. And we're really tempted when success seems impossible to give in. And I think one of the things we have to decide is the same sort of things that the porcupines decided. When the porcupines were there and that leopard came out, they could have decided that this is a loss. We're just going to minimize our loss. I mean, how often do we go into that mode? We're just going to minimize the loss. And they said, nah, man, I know it's a leopard, but this fight is not over yet. And we're going to stay in it to the very end. And we're going to use all the things we have to prevail as best we can. So throughout this series, I want to actually walk through one of my favorite books of the Old Testament, which is the book of Esther. Now, if you're familiar with the story, the book of Esther is about this young orphan girl who has tremendous challenges in her life, but ultimately rises up to be queen of Persia, the most powerful kingdom of its time. And as she rises up to be queen, along the way, she continues to deal with challenges. And ultimately, because of her work and her work with her cousin, a guy named Mordecai, they actually prevent the entire nation that she is from being wiped out. And that is not an exaggeration, that they are within days of having every single member of their nation wiped out. And what we see as we look at the story of Esther, the narrative of Esther, and as we look at the way Esther deals with things, I think Esther is an incredible model for how to address really difficult situations. Because I think one of the things that's always a temptation is that when we find ourselves in a really difficult situation, a situation that seems like there is no way out of this, we start to focus on the challenges We start to focus on the difficulties, and we start to focus on our own shortcomings. And we can be tempted to believe that success is impossible, that it's just too great. And so we're just going to try to minimize our losses. And my hope is that throughout this series, but particularly today, as we kind of kick off this series, that we can see that the value of our attitude is so important. The decision to say, you know what, I know this battle is hard. I know I don't control everything. But what I do know is the battle is not over yet. And so I'm going to stay in it using all I have access to win it. That's what I'm hoping we can come away with today. Now, as we kick off the series, and we get into the book of Esther. Book of Esther is kind of really interesting because it's very much like a traditional narrative. It's very much like, I don't know the way to say it. It's not like reading the Bible. It's like reading a story. It's written very much from a narrative standpoint. And so as you step into the book of Esther, one of the first people you meet is a guy named King Xerxes. Now, King Xerxes is the king of Persia. Now, Persia in this time frame is just a brutally in-charge kingdom. And King Xerxes ruled over kind of the entire known world, or very close to it in his time frame. And so King Xerxes actually inherited much of this. So the book of Esther takes place about 3 years into King Xerxes' rule. And so King Xerxes, as is so often the case, has quite a big ego. And so he decides about 3 years in that everyone needs to know just how wealthy he is. So he actually sets up a celebration, and he instructs his people to say, I want you to lay out all the wealth we have for people to come and admire it. And it's a 6-month-long celebration. So it's all spread out all around. People from all around come to see and ooh and ah over the wealth of the kingdom. And to show how wealthy he is, he closes out this 6 months with a banquet that's open to everyone, with unlimited food and unlimited drink, unlimited wine. And it goes on for 7 days. Unlimited eating and drinking for 7 days. What could possibly go wrong? Now, as you go into the banquet, things are so over the top. People are drinking from literally solid gold goblets. The furniture is made up of silver and gold. There's marble floors, marble columns. Everything is just gorgeous and amazing. And so the king wants to show all this off so people just know how important he is. And after 7 days of drinking, he makes a brilliant decision that he wants to show one more thing off. His queen. Text tells us that on the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was high in spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was very beautiful. Now what's happening here is the king's ego is really beginning to get the better of him, right? That he's showing off his queen, and it's important to understand that when we say queen, she's not like Queen Elizabeth, who actually had at least a little bit of authority. Not a lot, but a little bit. Queen Vashti doesn't really have authority. She has privilege. She's able to access things, but she's not in charge of anything. She is subject to the king as much as anyone is. So she's supposed to follow his authority. But we see a few things about the king's intent. Notice it says that she's supposed to come out with her crown. This is to show people that Queen Vashti is his property, because only the king controls the crown. So if I let her wear the crown, she belongs to me. And he wants everyone to know that. Now, some commentators on this narrative say that when it says have her come out wearing the crown, it means wearing only the crown. In other words, he wants to show off just how beautiful she is. That's not directly in the text, but it is a common view of many commentators. But whatever the case, whether it's just to show her off as property or something more than that, Queen Vashti does the unthinkable. She says, no, I will not come out. Now, this is the most powerful man in the world, Everyone says yes to this man. He doesn't hear no. And it infuriates him. And keep in mind, again, he's been drinking for 7 days. Right? His anger, he's overthrown with rage. And so he turns to his advisors and says, look at what she's doing. What should I do about this? Now keep in mind, the advisor's job is not to solve problems. What's the advisor's job? Keep the king happy. Keep the king happy. So one of the advisors steps forward and tells the king what he wants to hear. And this is so over the top. It says, the advisor answered the king and his nobles, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to the contempt and the anger. That doesn't seem likely. What are they doing? They're pumping up his ego. You are so important that every man in the kingdom looks to you. In fact, you are so important that every woman in the kingdom looks to you for how the household is supposed to work. So you've got to deal with this, not because it's for you, and not because of your ego, but you got to do it for the good of the kingdom. Which is, of course, garbage. But nonetheless, that's where they are. So one of the advisors says, what you need to do, king, is you need to write a decree. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. And they basically say, you're doing this for the good of the kingdom. Now, as I said, this is a bunch of garbage. It's obviously just playing to his ego, but the advisors achieve their goal. They soothe the king's ego, that you're doing this not just to protect your ego, but you're doing it for the good of the kingdom. And whatever the case, this has real consequences for Queen Vashti. And it says that she will be banished, forever banished. And there is disagreement on what forever banished means in this case. Some indications are that it simply means she's kind of sent off to another part of the palace, kind of locked away to live out her years. But there's a lot of evidence that indicates that forever banished means executed, to show that no one says no to the king. Whatever the case, she's now out of the picture. And eventually the king sobers up, starts to get sad. I don't have a queen anymore. What should I do? Again, remember, the king's attendants are one job. They have one job. Keep the king happy. So they come up with a plan. Here's the plan. Okay, king, you need another queen. The best way to go about this is you should sample all the young ladies throughout all of your kingdom. And in that, you will discover who should be your queen. King's like, I like this idea. Let's do that. So he then dispatches men, likely armies of men, out throughout his kingdom to go and find attractive young women and bring them back. And what happens if a girl says no? She goes anyway. Right? This is effectively kidnapping. Right? There is no saying no. They will come out, and if you have to go, you have to go. And this is where we meet the heroes of our story. This is where we meet Esther, who is a young orphan who's being raised by her cousin, a guy named Mordecai. Now, both Esther and Mordecai are part of the nation of Israel, but that nation has been conquered by Persia. So they are subjects of Persia. And they've likely been moved around because when you conquer a nation, one of the things that you'll often do is move the people away from their homeland so that they can't congregate and rise up against you. So they've had a pretty hard life. But one of the things that we're told is Esther is said to be beautiful of form and face. So she gets selected. She's selected to compete in the contest. She would not have seen this as good news, right? She's now has to leave her home, right? That her life has been difficult, and now she's basically being kidnapped to be a plaything for the king. Her life is hard, and it just got worse. And so as she heads to the palace, she has to now take place in this contest. And this is how this contest works. That young ladies throughout the kingdom are gathered up, brought back to the palace. There are likely hundreds of girls involved, possibly thousands of girls involved. Because this contest lasted for, we don't know exactly how long, but it could have been up to 4 years that this was going on. And so what happens is that when you arrive at the palace, you go through a year of beauty treatments. And you go through a year of preparation. And then, after this year of preparation, you've got one night to convince the king that you should be the queen. So what happens is you go through all this preparation, then there will come a time where you were taken to a room, likely multiple rooms, with jewelry and fine clothing all through it. You select what you want, and then you go see the king and demonstrate that you are his best choice to be queen. Now, there's an obvious question that comes to mind, right? Most of these girls are not going to want to be there. So it seems like the smart thing to do would be like, well, just do a really bad job and you get to go home, right? No. No matter how it turns out, you never go home. Basically, once you come to the palace, after your night with the king, you go to what's called the second harem. What that basically means is the section of the palace where you will live out the rest of your days. You will never see the king. You will never see the family. You'll be fed. You'll be housed. But you're effectively cloistered for the rest of your life. So that's the choices that you have. You either rise to become queen, or you are locked away from your family for the rest of your life. And that's the issue that Esther is facing. She's coming up against incredible odds as she does this. You know, and if we look at Esther's life, right, Esther's life seems to be just kind of one challenge after another. You know, first she loses her parents. You know, she's raised in a conquered state. I mean, fortunately, she actually has a cousin who cares for her, right? She gets moved away from her homeland, or at least doesn't get to grow up close to her homeland. And now, she's being groomed to be the king's plaything. And then, in all likelihood, thrown away. But I think the thing is that, although for Esther, her life has been challenging, and the challenges are continuing, I think the key thing that we see in Esther's life is she is so strong because of all the challenges. That it's all the challenges that she has dealt with throughout her entire life that made her strong enough to face this challenge. That in spite of the incredible odds against her, in spite of the incredibly low opportunity for success, she decides that she's not going to just give up, that she's going to do what she can to prevail. Because I think that she realizes that as much as this is a situation she doesn't like, she doesn't want to be in, her best chance for herself, and honestly for her cousin who's cared for her, is for her to prevail and become queen. And I think if we look at what she does, she gives us, I think, the fundamental formula for dealing with difficulties in our lives. Because this is a terrible situation that she is in, but it's the reality. And one of the key things that she does is I think she accepts her reality. Because I think one of the temptations that we all faced when we were dealing with an incredibly difficult situation, a situation where it seems like there is no way to prevail, we can start to kind of close off and stop looking at what's actually happening, to not face our reality. And if we don't accept the reality of the situation we're in, that means we are choosing to not have access to all the information. We are choosing to not look at everything that's going on around us, which means we are choosing to not try to succeed. So Esther accepts the reality of her situation, and in that, she decides the best chance is to try to be queen. So she uses her abilities to the best of her ability to try to prevail. She also leans really hard to God. She leans really hard into God. Because as bad as the situation is, it appears that God is actually in it somehow. That somehow God is bringing pieces together. Because knowing what she's facing, she arrives at the palace. And as soon as she arrives, the servant that's in charge of the entire contest, the highest ranking person in the contest, takes a liking to her and starts giving her special treatment, starts giving her special food, special cosmetics, assigns her a team of the best attendants to care for her in the year ahead. And he also advises her and he develops her. So he actually helps her be more successful. And one of the things that Esther does that I think is so important is that she accepts wise counsel. Because think of this situation, right? The situation she's in is incredibly isolating. She's away from the people she knows. But even though it's isolating, she chooses to find information where she can. And I think it's a temptation that we can face is that when we feel isolated, we don't look around for what we can find out. We can start to kind of come in on ourselves and not really communicate with other people. And she doesn't do that. Even though the situation is isolating, she utilizes good advice from people that she trusts. And we actually see two examples of that in the narrative. The first bit of advice is advice she got from her cousin as she was heading out. It said, Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. Now, why would he tell her not to tell them what your nationality is? Well, she would have actually undermined her success. Remember, this is for the queen of Persia. The king would expect the queen of Persia to be Persian, right? She's Israeli. So if she reveals her nationality, as much as that is an important part of who she is, she would have then been judged by that nationality. And it would actually lost her opportunity to be judged as who she is, as a person. So what she does is by not bringing that up, it allows her to be seen as an individual and compete as an individual. And she could actually be judged by her own personal presence. And then also she got good advice from the servant in charge. When it was Esther's turn to go to the king, she accepted the advice of the servant in charge. She asked for nothing except what he suggested, and she was admired by everyone who saw her. So what's going on there? Well, remember how it works, is that when the time comes to see the king, she's taken to a place filled with fine clothing and jewelry. And the expectation would be that many of the girls would have chosen lots of jewelry, really kind of dolled themselves way up to try to give themselves the best chance. But keep in mind, the king of Persia is probably the wealthiest man alive at this point. He sees gold and silver and jewelry and fine clothing all the time. I believe the advice that she was given was, you be you. You know, get a little bit of jewelry, a little bit of things that kind of accent things a bit, but walk in confident as the person that you are. And the king would have never seen that before. And I think that positioned her well. So with that, she accepted the reality of what she was dealing with. She took in good advice. She leaned into God. And she did her very best to succeed. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. By being confident that she had enough, by being confident that she was enough, she walked in. And he had no idea what to do with that. He had never seen that before. And he found that attractive. And he makes her queen. And because she becomes queen, we find that Mordecai gets a position actually near the palace. So instead of being separated from her family, she can now keep contact with her family. Now, this is not the kind of story I would normally do on a Sunday morning. It's not really a very nice story. But I think it shines a bright light on a few things. It certainly shines a bright light on the brutality and injustice of the ancient world. There's no doubt about that. But Esther, I think, shows us some really important things. And this is just getting started. You know, Esther shows us the value of valuing yourself. Although this is a terrible situation that she is in. I believe she prevails because of her confidence in herself. She prevailed because of the support of people who cared for her. Right? She prevailed because of her willingness to look at a really difficult situation and not give up. and actually try to prevail. And I think that it shows us a formula for how we can deal with those most difficult times in our lives. Because again, for Esther, she didn't choose this. This wasn't fair. This was wrong. But it was a reality. But how often in our own lives do we end up with illnesses or situations or losses that are not fair, that are not our fault, that are not our choice? What Esther shows us is that we have two choices in this. We can focus on the fact that it's not fair, that it's not our fault, and it's not our choice, and there's nothing I can do, and how did they end up here? Or you can do what Esther did, and you face it, and you deal with it, and you do the best you can in it. I think she shows us that we can make ourselves successful, even in the most difficult situations. It doesn't mean that it ends up the way we wanted. I'm sure that Esther would have far rather just gone back home. But that wasn't an option. So she found the best path forward that she could. Right, she worked hard. She sought good advice. She trusted that God was in it with her. She leaned into God. And she found people she could trust. And I'm sure the narrative never talks about this, but I'm sure she actually ran into a lot of people she could not trust. And she kept them at arm's length. And it's only because she did all of those things. The only reason we even know her name is because she did all those things. The only reason we know her story. And as we will eventually see, the only reason that her people even survive is because she did this. But that's the story for another week.